Mm-hmm. Yeah, 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 and that is that is symptomatic, I would say, of yeah, yeah, that is symptomatic of a community that cares for itself. Yeah. What are the little behaviors that we kind of maybe take for granted in terms of patience? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. As kind of a counter to that cohesion that exists within a community. Yeah, and it's individualism when it strays into narcissism, right? When it's I at the cost of you, right? Rather than you and me together, is a big deal. Touch, yeah. Say more, Wayne. Yeah. Are you a hugger? No. You learn to be, yeah. Me and you both. Yeah. Yeah. Ah. Yeah. Ah. Sure. He longed for not even just companionship, but contact. Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough thing, isn't it? I mean, okay. Sorry, I'll talk about babies for a second. Not being an expert, but James is 3 weeks old now, and again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here in regards to those of you who have been parents. But about a week ago, he just woke up in the middle of the night and started screaming, and they were terrified, being new parents. I'm like, what? He was fine. Like the last 2 weeks, he was fine. All of a sudden, well, apparently, right around 2 weeks is when the child begins to realize they're not in the womb anymore, right? And so there's like an existential anxiety of like, I'm in this big world that I understand nothing about. And so now for the last week, during the daytime, he sleeps fine in the rocker or wherever. At night, he has to sleep with skin contact. He needs to hear a heartbeat, Yeah, I know, interesting. And of course, Asal is like, well, I don't want to spoil him, but to get the sound, that's great. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, yeah. But yes, physical contact is another aspect, which is interesting too when you're talking about offering hospitality. It's one of the things that you have to discern is, how much your guest is comfortable with that, depending on their context and culture. It's another thing that we take for granted. Even on Sunday morning, right? I know many of you are huggers, and I know many people are fist bumpers, and it's like, how do we make that work? I don't mean to belabor the point, but one of the things that I think is important to think about in terms of understanding the necessity and the requirement of hospitality in the ancient world is just kind of how thin a veneer, civilization is. Oftentimes, we take for granted that we live in a world where we aren't adversaries with our neighbors, and where we don't, lie, steal, and cheat. Steat, and cheat. It sounds like a comedy duo. Key and Peele. Anyways, we do take it for granted, and living in the world that we do, which the United States has experienced great prosperity and wealth for most of its existence, I think we are often ignorant to how quickly that can devolve into kind of everybody for their own self. And hospitality in the ancient world was one of the ways that you guaranteed that. Right? It was the nod or the handshake. Quickly rounding this out, so hospitality was not just about food; it was about physical protection as well too. You were taking the other person's well-being into your care and responsibility. One of the things that we noticed too is it takes a long time. In terms of oh yeah, Sarah, if you could just go slaughter that calf real quick and whip up some bread from scratch, that'd be great. Just a small meal for me and my buds, And poor Sarah, is in the back room, laboring away with her servants. Meanwhile, Abraham and the three guys are out drinking, I don't know, cocktails on the porch or whatever you did. And then there was a fourth thing, which is slipping my brain right now. But mainly I want us to kind of hold those in the back of our heads, because today we're going to look at what happens when hospitality disintegrates. Okay. So if you got a Bible, great. If you don't, you might want one. We're going to turn to Genesis 19. Let me know when you're there. Well, I'll wait. All right, everybody there-ish? I assume most folks recognize this story from the title. What's the heading you guys have at the top of 19? Okay, perfect. That's what mine says. We're actually jumping in halfway into this story already. The end of 18 is another familiar story that does pop up in our lectionary, and it's where Abraham argues with God, where God has declared the sin of Sodom, and Abraham is arguing with God about whether or not it's worth saving the city for 100 righteous people or 50 or even 10 righteous people. And again, this is an odd thing for us, to struggle with this idea that, number one, you would argue with God, but that you would have to convince God of something. And of course, part of me just wants you to let that sit uncomfortably. 17, something like that. It comes to God and is like, I can't deal with these people anymore. They complain nonstop. They just whine, and I feel like I'm carrying them on my shoulders alone. And comes to God and is like, I think we should start over. and God says back to Moses, in fact, I'm paraphrasing again. Well, these are the people that I brought out of Egypt, and blah blah blah. Right? Okay. And then my favorite, I think it's the following chapter, is Jephthah, Moses' father-in-law, comes to Moses and is like, I'm going to teach you a word. It's called delegation. You got to learn to divvy up that responsibility. Well, 10 chapters later in Genesis 32, we get the story of the golden calf. And now Moses is up with God on the mountain, and God is like, I'm sick of these people. They're hard-hearted. They complain nonstop. There's a sound of war down in the camp. I'm going to get rid of them and start over. And then Moses says back to God, these are the people that you brought out of Egypt. And I love that. I love the duality of that, because it is the turnabout, but it's also, Moses suddenly embodying what he was struggling with, 10 chapters before. Similarly, we have Abraham, who has been, promised the covenant with the divine, and of course, the covenant of, your descendants are going to number as the stars. But Abraham is kind of in this wandering phase where he's still trying to find where home is. He and Sarah have not had a child yet. They've not settled down yet. And so they come upon this city of Sodom, where Lot, who is one of Abraham's cousins, I always forget this, cousin, whatever. Lot lives in Sodom. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is Lot, nephew? Okay, sounds great. Lot was also a foreigner in Sodom, okay? Lot was from the same tribe as Abraham. Obviously, they're related. So he is living as a foreigner in Sodom. Abraham comes upon the city, and God says, I'm going to destroy the city for its sin. Does not articulate what that sin is at that point in time, just that it's a great sinful nation, a great sinful city. And Abraham argues with God, saying, but would you withhold destruction for 100 righteous persons? And God says, yes, I would. And then Abraham, being a great used car salesman, is like, what about 50? What about 10? Okay. Which, again, is this wonderful duality of, we get hung up on this idea of God destroying a city, but it's not necessarily about God, it's about Abraham in this case, to a certain extent. So, finally, Abraham does not enter the city, but some angels do. And that's what we're picking up in Genesis 19. 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting down in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, and again, this is important, considering because again, Abraham argues with God, what about 100, what about 50, what about 10? And the text is careful to tell us all of them, to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But the men replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Okay, let's get the obvious out of the way first, which is that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been used as a text for time immemorial as a condemnation against people against gay people. Okay, all because we get icky around sex, where we read this story of men wanting to know the alien in their midst, and Lot doing, again, from a modern perspective, the awful thing of offering up his daughters instead. We'll come back to that. I would call your attention as well to Judges 19, which is an interesting parallel of this story, which we studied about a year ago. And again, that's the story of the Levite and his concubine, where they are in one of the towns in the tribe of Benjamin, and similar, almost exact same plot, and they end up sending the concubine out to be ravaged, raped by the men there who are seeking to do violence against the Levite, who is also a foreigner. Okay, this is not about homosexuality. This is not about LGBTQ folks. This is not about same gender love, affection, relationships, right? This is about violence, okay? This is about people using sexuality as a weapon against the foreigner, okay? This is not absent from history, my friends. Okay, lest I offend your gentle ears, I want you to understand that this is a tool that has been used by humanity against both men and women for human history. And we could get into a long argument about the nature of sexuality and why it's used as a weapon and all that jazz. But I just want you to understand that this is just the subtext in this story, right? This is the tool of violence that's being used in this case. It has nothing to do with relationships, gendered or otherwise. It has everything to do with dehumanizing and belittling, okay? And again, lest we set ourselves on a high horse, I want us to think about the language that we often use against people that we deem as our opponents or our enemies, and the ways in which we belittle or dehumanize them. And again, it seems better because we're only using words, but the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree in that regard.
So he was not interested in his reputation.
Lot. Well, this is the question, isn't it? Because let's draw a contrast, okay? So what does Lot do? So these 2 angels show up in town, and the picture that's in my head, and feel free to use your own imagination, the picture in my head is that everybody in the town, like, their radars go off immediately, like, you don't belong here, boy. I don't know why I'm using a southern accent. Deliverance, that's why, Yeah. Which I read an interesting article once saying, which basically was making the argument that Judges 19 was essentially the story of deliverance played out in an ancient world. Anyways, another story, another day. So they don't look like you, right? That's the thing. These two angels, and what do these angels look like? We have no idea. Okay, are they two out of the three that showed up with Abraham? Are they different angels? Keep in mind that the word in Hebrew for angel means messenger, okay? So there's some ambiguity. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the locals recognize a stranger, okay? That's the point. Not only do they recognize that the angels are a stranger, they are reluctantly living with Lot, the alien, as they call him, in their town. So let's contrast real quickly. So what does Lot do for these two angels? Yes. Yes. Lot approaches these two foreigners. He recognizes them, says, "You can't sleep out here," right? You ever had that experience? I mean, not again, but metaphorically speaking, where you've come into a town and you meet a local and they're like, "You probably don't want to go to that area," right? Or you're going to want to stay somewhere else, or you want to shop. Has anybody ever had that experience? Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but I'm not coming up with anything. But I definitely... Realtors are a good example. How so?
When we were looking for a house, they steered us.
Sure, yeah.
We had no clue.
Well, it's really funny. This is, again, going back to the baby shower. We were all kind of reminiscing on how lucky we are to be in this neighborhood where we all get along. And one of the people that was there was like, "Yeah, well, the house I moved out of, I went back to see it, and now it's like dilapidated, and it's essentially become a drug home, and just like contrasting where you lived versus where you live now." But we get what's going on here, right? Like Lot is like, you don't want to sleep in the town square. I want you to understand that would have been a normal thing. Okay, the town square is the town square on purpose, right? That is essentially the public gathering space. I was watching a YouTube video of a guy that's been traveling throughout rural China. And that's where he stays. He has a tent, and he's not the only one. There is literally a town square in almost every town, and anybody that's traveling through, that's where they camp, right? Whether they're pulling up in a truck and sleeping on the back of it, or whether they're actually setting up a tent. Historically speaking, that was the purpose of it. It's where you got your information. That's where the town crier would go. That's where you gathered for festivals or parties or whatever. But it's also where, when you entered into a town for the first time, that's where you went right away, because that's where the news was, and that's where you could camp out. So these two guys are doing the normal thing. They show up, they're ready to set up their tents, and Lot comes to them and says, "You don't want to sleep here." He probably had experience, is what it is. I mean, and I don't know if there's a good comparison here, but Lot has been living here. It's obvious from the way that he is treated by the townsfolk that they barely tolerate his presence as it is. He recognizes the dangerous situation. He's like, yeah, a premonition, but also he's like, this isn't going to end well. So what does he do? He approaches them and says, "You don't want to sleep here." He offers them his home, and in doing so, offers them hospitality. Okay? This is important. He offers them hospitality. What is entailed in hospitality? It's all the things that we mentioned. Food. What does he do? He prepares a fine feast for them, the text says, including unleavened bread. Okay, prepares for them a fine feast. He offers them safety, right, which is evidenced from the fact that when the men of the city come to do violence against them, he stands in the door. Can you picture this image? Standing in the doorway, trying to block all these dudes from breaking the door down and coming on in. And at the end, there's the magic involved. Shuts the door and the men are blinded. I guess maybe the angels were doing some goofy things there. Who knows? But he does the things, right? He offers the hospitality. This is the crux of the story because it is a contrast against the behavior of the men in Sodom. Okay, so they do the exact opposite. Okay, they do not offer safety. They threaten danger, right? They do not offer food or nourishment. They seek to damage the bodies of the guests. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuality. It's about inhospitality, right? It's about xenophobia, okay? And I would argue so is Judges 19. And again, we from a modern perspective who over the last 40 years, well, more than that, 60, 80 years have culturally struggled to accept the reality of LGBTQ folks into our midst, we make it about that. It ain't about that, okay? Anybody reading this story in the ancient world would have known exactly what's going on, okay? They would have understood this because they would have understood the threat that inhospitality offers when you act with anger and violence towards your neighbor or towards the alien. And again, there are so many, and I'm preaching a little bit here and I apologize, but there are so many examples in our scriptural witness. We just did this study when we did a study on strangers in the Bible, right? How many examples are there where God explicitly says, protect the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the stranger in your midst, okay? This is the base. This is the baseline. If you do anything, do that. So to offer violence to the stranger is to come directly in conflict with righteousness, okay? Which is what Abraham was vying about.
Well, I have to bring up that Lot offers his virgin daughter.
Okay, I said we were going to come back to that. Yeah. Okay.
You weren't going to skip that, were you?
Nope. Nope. No, I would not have skipped that. Maybe by a lapse in memory, but not intentionally, because it's an important part of the story. And there are lots of things that I could say to explain away, right? So women in that ancient world were effectively property. Daughters, especially until they were married, were the dad's property. When they were married, they became the husband's property. So in a very real way, he could do with them whatever he wanted. Is this cruel? Yes. Is it not evidencing great parenting skills? Absolutely, right? I shouldn't say this, not just from a modern perspective, but from two things about it. One, I've already said, which is that context and culture, again, not that it's right, it was kind of the way things were done, okay? The other thing I would say is that this story is really heavily on the contrast, okay? And the specific thing that incident is highlighting is that it wasn't about sex, okay? It's not about sex. This is what drives me nuts, because those who have used this text as a weapon against LGBTQ stuff in the past have been like, well, they turned down the women because they wanted the men so much. I'm like, are you telling me that an entire town full of human beings that seem to have populated nicely is just full of people that don't come on here. Let's use some part of our rational brains here. It's not about sex, it's about violence. It's about hurting the stranger. That's what's going on here. It's not about choosing between women or men. Because the text plays up the fact that it's not just girls, it's virgins, right? For whatever reason, right? For whatever reason was like the ultimate temptation, there's a story, there's reasoning, it's not just sexual, right? It's that, a virgin is a blank slate, right? In terms of being able to get children and all that jazz. They're valuable, is the short version of it. So the reason the text highlights, Lot offering up his virginal daughters is it's showing this isn't about sex. It's about inhospitality. It's about violence. It's about xenophobia. This isn't about the pleasure of the men gathered. This is about them getting to exact anger and violence upon the foreigner and the stranger in their midst, okay? And again, you're totally 100%, justified in looking at that and going, well, come on. Because again, and this is one of the things that we have to remember too, is that we can't always read the Bible as if everybody in it is righteous. Lot is not righteous, right? Lot is righteous-ish, but he's not. This isn't Jesus we're talking to. We're talking about a human being whose wife gets turned into a pillar of salt, and he just keeps going. Okay. So when violence does get visited upon this town, it's not a judgment or a condemnation upon the sexuality or lack thereof in the town. It's a commentary on the inhospitality of the town. And here's the thing: is that last spiel, and then we'll turn to a different text. One of the important things to remember about the Old Testament is that the Hebrew philosophy does not make a distinction between natural events and God's action. They're all one and the same, right? So when a hurricane wipes out a village, God did that, right? Just like those stickers that are going up right now. Sorry, never mind. And again, it's because God is the author of creation. God is the prime mover. God is responsible for all that happens, and it does not evidence intent, right? So it's not saying that, well, God did that because God was angry at you. It's just that God is involved in everything, and so when that happens, does that make sense? It's hard for us to wrap our brains around because this ventures into realms of theodicy, which we're really uncomfortable with, and we articulate that very differently. Again, I would articulate that natural disasters are natural and they're part of the world that God has formed out of chaos, and yet there are realities and there are consequences. So if you live below sea level near a coastline, don't be shocked when you get flooded. It's still tragic, when people lose their homes and their livelihoods because of that. But it's just kind of, tornadoes are a thing. Global climate change is a thing. That we did that. We can't lay that one at the feet of God. We did that.
Why do you think people continue to build where their property's been totally destroyed?
Hubris and desperation. I mean, I love to poke fun at people that live in Florida. And again, I'm from Michigan, right? So like Florida is straight down I-75, and so it was always a lot of Michiganders go down to Florida for vacation or whatnot. And so Florida wasn't as bad as Ohio. Let's be fair. Ohio. Sorry if any of you are from Ohio. Ohio was the pit of the earth because that's where Ohio State University is, and so it's Michiganders. Which is the correct demonym, by the way. Michigander, not Michiganian, none of those other ones. Michiganders, like the geese. So, anyways, I often poke fun at people in like the lowlands of Florida whose homes keep getting destroyed by hurricanes. But similar to Hurricane Katrina, one of the realities is poverty as well too. And like I understand it now, right? I have a home. I have a house. It's not just a building. It's where I am. It's where my home is, and I know that the Cascadia subduction zone is going to go one of these days, and maybe my home's going to slide down into the gully behind us. I don't know what'll happen, and I not only dread that because of the consequences, but I also can't imagine losing my home, if that makes sense. So I think one of the other things is that they know it's going to get flooded again, but it's home,
I recently saw a commercial regarding Topeka, Kansas.
Yeah.
They were advertising.
Tornado Alley.
No, they were advertising, come live here because we have affordable homes, we have good jobs, la 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 la, all these things to come to. The next day, the tornadoes hit, and I said, that's why.
Yeah.
People
Oh.
don't be in Kansas.
Well, that's one of the reasons. And God bless people from Kansas. I think it's great. It's not my temperate zone, if that makes sense. I couldn't take it. Yeah. Yeah. Andy. Yeah. Yeah. Like a root cellar. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
With some kind of a shelter.
Yeah.
Zero.
Yeah.
And why is that? It costs money.
Yeah. Well, and people don't store their food in the root cellar anymore either. That's part of the problem.
That's another great point.
Yeah.
The problem is,
When your freezer dies because you lost your power, where are you going to keep your perishables? Yeah.
in that area, it's quite common
Yeah.
for the developer to come in and level the land.
Yeah.
They put a slab of concrete
Yeah.
in the land.
Yeah.
They don't put a basement. And I had a friend who lived in Texas. He lost one home to a tornado.
Jeez Louise.
Why don't you have a tornado a shelter, a basement? Oh, you can't do. We have caliche cells. I said, hold it. Excuse me. That's why you put a foundation.
Yeah.
Get away from that stuff.
Yeah.
It's a mindset.
Yeah, yeah, and and it's greed on the part of developers. It's a complex issue. Yeah.
My grandfather was the only person in San Antonio that I knew of that had a basement.
Yeah.
And it was he converted it to a bomb shelter.
Yeah, weird factoid. Did you know that in Switzerland it's required that you have a bomb shelter? Even new construction, it's mandated that you have. So we visited our friends in Baden, Switzerland, and they share a bomb shelter with they have a townhouse type home. They share a bomb shelter with their neighbor. So their half of the bomb shelter has the beds. Their neighbor's half of the bomb shelter has the running water. And there's like a door, like you get in the hotels, there's like a door that goes in between the two. I'm like, I hope you guys get along well. I mean, it's, yeah, different world. Not belaboring the point, just, again, we don't have to spend a lot of time with Sodom and Gomorrah, but I hope this kind of like it makes the case that just how important, prevalent, and sacred hospitality was in that ancient world. And it's not just an idea, it is how you make sure that the world doesn't fall apart, right? It's how, so again, I'm asking, I asked you, how do we make sure that our world doesn't fall apart? Well, it's kind of similar things. Community, neighborhood, it's taking care of each other, it's all that. So even when the Cascadia subduction zone goes, you're making sure that your neighbors are okay. That's it. Hospitality was the way that manifested in the ancient world. When you do not offer hospitality, but when you act against hospitality, it's not just a threat to the people living there, it's a threat to the entire region. Okay? Because again, we get so weirded out by the idea of, and rightly so, God, sending a pillar of fire to destroy Sodom. And again, I pointed out, not a single man was innocent, because that was important for Abraham's part of the narrative. Not even for one, not a single man was in it. They all showed up to do violence. But it's not just about punishment, it's about erasing a threat to the rest of that region. Does that make sense? And again, we see this in Judges 19, that awful, awful story where we see the consequences of this, where the Levite, after his concubine gets raped to death, chops her body up into 12 pieces and sends a part to each tribe of Israel, encouraging them to war and genocide against the tribe of Benjamin, because that is evidence that Benjamin is such a threat that they have to wipe it out to a human being, right? Not necessarily that it's right. Just telling you. Kieran.
And I guess looking back, I had to look back because I forgot the gap. God had tried to get Lot out of Sodom before. Kidnapped, it would seem to be a bad thing.
Yeah.
Kidnapped and rescued by Abraham.
Yep.
Forcefully grabbed.
Yeah.
And then the angels, he still wants to stay.
Still wants to stay in there.
Has to yank him out again.
Yeah.
God in his mercy.
God sends in an extraction team.
And a couple of enemy kings to raid him. And
Yep.
God's very wealthy.
Yeah.
He and Abraham. So obviously he's pretty big.
He likes it there.
He's a big deal.
It's home.
Apparently.
Yeah. Yeah.
He just keeps going back.
Keeps going back. Keeps going back.
Not to say, you can't go home again, but
Not for Lot. Well, and just a quick note, this has always been one of the fascinating details in my brain is this, the similarity between Lot's wife getting frozen in a pillar of salt and Eurydice, getting sucked back into Hades as Orpheus is walking away. Not that they're necessarily the same story, but there's this common thread of don't look back on the past. Don't look back on the past. In Lot's case, I think it has a lot to do with God's been trying to extract Lot for several years, and Lot's been a stick in the mud about it. And so it's like, well, you just got to keep going, okay? In in Orpheus's case, it's don't look back on death. Don't look back on death. Anyways, what time? 10:20. It's okay. We're gonna flip to Acts 28, and we'll do this as a preface for time that we spend next week, because I want to spend these last couple of weeks in the New Testament. We've spent a lot of time in the Old Testament. This is a relatively unfamiliar story, I think. This isn't one that pops up in the lectionary. I don't remember doing a lot of classes on this one. Does this story ring a bell? Ring a bell for any? Paul on the island of Malta? No, I don't think so. Okay. So I'm going to give you the backstory here. Chapter 27 is about Paul getting shipwrecked. Do you guys remember that story from Sunday school? Yeah, this is kind of one of the famous ones. A big storm comes through as Paul is on his way to Rome, and they get shipwrecked. Paul ends up on a small island. They end up drifting for like 2 weeks or something like that. And then finally they see land, and it turns out it's the island of Malta. So they end up drifting on there. They strike a reef. Acts 28 by telling you the story of Acts 27. Okay, Acts 28. After we had, excuse me, choking on my own saliva. I'm an evolved human being. After we had reached safety, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us unusual kindness. Since it had begun to rain and it was cold, they kindled a fire and welcomed all of us around it. Paul had gathered a bundle of brushwood and was putting it on the fire when, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the local people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, man, I love this. This man must be a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were expecting him to swell up or drop dead, but after they had waited a long time and saw that nothing unusual happened to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. Now in the vicinity of that place were lands belonging to the leading men of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It so happened that the father of Publius lay sick in bed with fever and dysentery. Paul visited him and cured him by praying and putting. After this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They bestowed many honors on us, and when we were about to sail, they put on board all the provisions we needed. Okay, pause. Who wants the mic?
Do you want to say what we learned about today, or do you want me?
Go up, September.
No, you go first. Do you want to say, what did we learn about?
We learned about
Read the top. So in the gospel that we're going to hear later, we talked about that God is the way, the truth, and the life. And so what we talked about is how can we live the truth and the life of God so we could go to God's house. And so what the girls made were stop signs or stoplights to talk about what they could do. So September, why don't you read yours?
it's the first one that's red, stop, listen to God. And what I'm going to do is going to church. And then yellow is slow, make time for God, is being kind on my yellow one. And green is go God's way every day and love God.
Okay, MJ. So you're going to listen to God by
Say my prayers at night.
you're gonna slow down and make time for God by thinking of God when you see.
I'm gonna slow down at God and think about God and
When you see beautiful things.
when you see beautiful things.
Go God's way. Okay, so you're gonna go God's way every day by showing love.
Showing love.
There we go. Thank you, MJ. Oh, walk. You can keep them. I'm just nervous about
Thank you, MJ and September. Thanks, Max and Jamie. Jamie must be psychic because she basically teaches the kids my sermon before Sunday morning every time. Is MJ taking on a career as a prize fighter or something? Is she headbutting people? That'll do it. What time is it? 10:27. Okay, let's kind of put a ellipsis on this. So this story is part of the larger narrative of the end of Paul's journeys, right? So we're getting towards the end of the book of Acts, and as we know, once Paul gets imprisoned and things go poorly, but the story leading up to this is this kind of the question of the journey, right? The question of the journey, whether or not they should go to Rome in the first place. As they're beginning to set sail, Paul, in fact, kind of forecasts. He's talking to the centurion that's in charge of the ship, and he's like, I don't see this going well. In fact, he said it's something like, I see great danger and disaster if we set out now, or something like this. But essentially, there's kind of an argument about whether they should even sail to Rome at this point. But they set out anyways. And then, of course, they're not on the seas for long, and this south wind or west wind comes through, and to make a long story short, storm comes through, wrecks the ship, and they end up on the island of Malta. Here's one of the fascinating things about this text for me is, and again, I don't know if this is a thing or not, but I've always felt it's been a mirror of another text, which is the widow at Zarephath, which obviously everybody's familiar with. But it's a story that's one of Elijah's stories, where after Elijah gets involved in the big prophet throwdown, you remember that one where he butts heads with the prophets of Baal, and there's one of my favorite, where he's like, you get a cow and I get a cow. We'll each pray around our cow, and the first cow to catch on fire wins, right? And so the prophets of Baal, I can't remember, it's like for 3 days and 3 nights, they chant and pray around their cow, and nothing happens. And then Elijah takes his cow, cuts it up into a bunch of pieces, digs a trench around it, fills the trench with water, and the thing immediately goes up in flames. And then he ends up, through a series of misfortunate events, killing all the prophets of Baal. And then he flees. He's so devastated. He's like, my life. He's like, I came here to, preach repentance to the people of Israel, and all I ended up doing was getting in a fight and screwing it all up. At some point, he ends up on the mountaintop in the cave, with, God speaking to him out of the silence, not out of the whirlwind or the tempest. But there's another story which is in that same region, which is Elijah gets sent into Zarephath, which is in like Tyre or Sidon, somewhere up in modern day Lebanon. And he gets there and he finds a widow who is basically dying. Her and her son are starving to death. And he comes and he's like, God told me to come here that you were going to offer me hospitality. And she's like, yeah, but we're starving to death. She's like, I think I've got a little bit of grain left. I can mix it with some mud and make you something. So to make a long story short, Paul ends up blessing her jar of oil. He ends up blessing her bag of grain and whatever. So she's, restores her fortunes. Then her son dies, and he effectively resurrects her son. So what's interesting about that story, and what I see mirrored in Acts 28, is this idea of kind of like the reversal of circumstances, where Elijah thinks he's going up there to receive hospitality offered by the widow, and he ends up returning the blessing by essentially restoring her fortunes. In this story, Paul ends up getting blown off course, wrecks on the island of Malta, and essentially the entire crew is rescued by these Maltese. This is the right demonym for, not Maltons, Maltese. The Maltese Falcon, that's all I can think of. He gets rescued by these Maltese. They take care of him. He ends up staying there for it's either 3 weeks or 3 months, maybe 3 months, on the island waiting for, shelter. But there's this great story where he gets bitten by a snake, right? And they're like, must be karma. Must be karma. He must have done something wrong. Otherwise, the snake wouldn't have bit him, which I'd just get a kick out of. He survives it, but then he ends up healing a bunch of people of their illnesses. And one of the things, and we'll talk more about this next week, I need to wrap up, but one of the things that I've always found interesting about this is that it's putting forward this idea embedded in hospitality is that, yeah, you do hospitality because it's the right thing to do, but this is showcasing the interconnectivity of how a hospitality network works, right? Which is that I care for you, you care for me, okay? And again, I don't want to overstate it, but I can't. The importance of how that network guaranteed civilization and has guaranteed civilization throughout all of human history, right? If you can stop killing your neighbor long enough to get to know them, it ends up being better for the both of you, right? And again, how important and fragile that is in the world that we live in. We are so privileged to have had relative peace and prosperity over the courses of our lifetimes, how easily that can those threads can pull apart, and conversely, how important it is that we offer hospitality. And this is my case that I'm going to be making over the next couple of weeks, that's why this is important. That's why church is important, is because this is a center of hospitality, right? We are a nexus. We are the gravity well, gravity is the opposite, but we extend hospitality into our neighborhood. That's what we should be doing, right? We should be exuding hospitality and welcome and kindness in such a way that it's infectious in our neighborhood, and by doing so, we're an island of stability in a world which can really increasingly become frayed. And yeah. 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 because they understand the importance of it. And I don't even know that it's a rational, they're not doing math. It's just so ingrained in their being, right? In our being, it should be as well, too, that this is just what we do, right? This is just what we do. Anyways. All right, folks, thank you. We'll be back next week with more fun adventures. We'll talk more about Acts 28, and or we'll go on to the next text we're going to look at is the Last Supper. So.